rental house sat on a natural shelf carved into the hillside, high enough above the churning river to catch the wind, but low enough that every afternoon the foggy woods delivered a thick, palpable silence that felt less like peace and more like an abrasive interruption. Tiff and Mallory had driven 11 hours to reach the place, trading the predictable, sterile scent of city asphalt and office disinfectant for the aggressive perfume of the deep woods, pine needles, wet moss, and something else. Something metallic and cold that clung stubbornly to the old clapboard siding of the house. Tiff, a man whose entire professional life revolved around spreadsheets and the immutable logic of the quarterly report, found the initial quiet unnerving. It was too quiet. This was the kind of quiet that confirmed the thing making the noise watched him from just out of sight. Mallory, who saw the world in gradients and apertures, loved it instantly. For her, the house was a sanctuary, a weathered, honest counterpoint to the synthetic rhythm of their former lives. The first few days were soaked in manufactured serenity. They drank coffee thick as syrup on the tiny peeling front porch, listening to the river churn below, far out of sight. The air was consistently damp, holding a steady temperature right around 55 degrees Fahrenheit in the early mornings. Even in the middle of June, they unpacked boxes filled with books they had sworn they would read and camping gear they certainly would not use. Tiff tried to connect the laptop to an antenna, getting nothing but static. "We do not need it," Mallory had insisted, already framing up a shot of the gnarled oak that guarded the wellhead. "We came here to unplug, remember?" By the third afternoon, Tiff decided to tackle the ancient wood stove in the living room. It was a squat, heavy cast-iron beast, stained black with years of soot and misuse. The previous tenants had used it to burn everything from pine cones to plastic. Tiff spent the afternoon scraping out the flue with a wire brush. The smell of burnt iron, dead ashes, and sulfurous residue hanging heavy in the tight air. He worked slowly, methodically. He liked the weight of the metal, the simple mechanics of the damper. It gave him the illusion of control, of domestic competence. When he finally had a small, clean fire going, a fragile column of heat rose into the room. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the fresh brewed coffee that Mallory brought him. It was the smell of home, of deep, impenetrable domesticity, and for a few hours, the unsettling quiet of the woods felt completely defeated. Mallory, meanwhile, was obsessed with the fog. Every evening, almost precisely at 7 o'clock, the temperature dropped 5 degrees, and the low-lying valleys began to steam. The fog was not light and wispy. It was a dense, three-dimensional wall of white, rolling in silently, swallowing the river, the gravel drive, and the entire lower stretch of the mountain. It turned the house into an island in a milk-white ocean. She took dozens of photos, trying to capture the sheer visual weight of it, the way it muted all sound and erased the world 15 feet past the railing. "It is beautiful, Tiff," she said one evening, watching the white tendrils creep across the lawn. "But it feels heavy. It is not just water vapor." Tiff, always the pragmatist, shrugged. "Condensation, Mally. Basic physics. The river cools faster than the air up here." But as the days slipped into the routine of isolation, even Tiff's sturdy pragmatism began to crack around the edges. It started with small things he could almost rationalize. Mallory was the first to notice the marks. They walked the perimeter of the small yard one damp morning after the fog lifted the ground. A mix of clay and soggy pine needles held impressions easily. They were looking at a deer trail near the old shed when Mallory pointed to a series of tracks leading toward the house, then vanishing near the porch steps. "Look at this, Tiff." Tiff knelt down. The tracks were wide, wider than his size 12 work boots, and deep. Too deep for a dog or a coyote. A large wolf. "A mountain lion," Tiff asserted. "It is not a mountain lion," she said, her voice quiet. "Lions walk on 4 paws. These are paired, and they are too big for any timber wolf I have ever seen. They looked clumsy, like something massive trying to walk upright. The toes were distinct, separated, but the heel impression was huge, almost plate-like. They looked too powerful, too purposefully placed." Tiff stood up, brushing the damp earth from his jeans. "Come on, Mally. Bears grow large out here. It is just a bear, confused by the smell of our trash." But the next day, the tracks reappeared, leading not to the trash cans, but directly to the glass sliding door of the sun porch. Then came the sounds at night. The temperature dropped, the fog rolled in, and the world shrank down to the 4 damp walls of the rental. They lay in bed, the silence so profound it hurt the ears, when the low sound began. It was not a growl, nor a howl, and definitely not the snap of a deer's twig. It was a hum, a low, even non-human snoring that vibrated through the foundation. It was too deep to be heard with the ears alone. It was felt in the chest cavity, a steady infrasonic thrum that confirmed an immense, stable mass just outside the door. It sounded like something impossibly huge had just settled down on the gravel path 10 feet away, breathing evenly, patiently waiting. "What is that?" Mallory whispered one night, clutching Tiff's arm so hard her fingernails dug in. Tiff's mouth was dry. He felt the vibration in the soles of his feet, even through the mattress. "Old plumbing, pressure," he stated. "Pressure does not breathe, Tiff." He held her tighter, pulling the rough cotton blanket up over their shoulders, trying to impose the comforting reality of their shared body heat against the alien cold that was seeping in from the forest. The humming continued, a deep, mechanical purr that was utterly horrifying in its calm regularity. It vibrated for 45 minutes before suddenly, completely ceasing, leaving behind a vacuum of silence that felt even more dangerous than the sound the worst came early one morning. Tiff was meticulous about security. Years in the city had trained him to check every lock twice. He remembered latching the old, warped wooden door leading out to the small back terrace, sliding both the brass bolts firmly into place, pulling on the handle to confirm. Yet, when he went to make coffee at 6:15 a.m., he noticed it. The terrace door was slightly ajar. Not enough to swing open, but enough that the humid morning air, smelling faintly of wet dog and cold earth, was flowing into the kitchen. The top brass bolt was still engaged, but the lower one had been smoothly drawn back. Tiff stood there for a long moment, the warmth of the coffee mug seeping into his fingers. He looked at the heavy brass bolt, seeing the faint scraped crescent where something rigid had tried to wedge it open, or more chillingly, something flexible had reached in and slowly, carefully, drawn the latch. He slammed the door shut and slid the bolts home with a heavy final sound. When Mallory came into the kitchen, Tiff was already halfway through rationalizing the event. It was the wind, Mally. An updraft from the river. This old house, the wood warps, the frame settles. The wind catches it just right, vibrates the lock. "Tiff, the wind does not unlock a bolt." "It is physics," he repeated aggressively. The vibration of the house settling did the rest. He repeated variations of this explanation all morning, running the variables through his head, trying to apply the logic of the spreadsheet to the unsettling reality of the deep woods. But deep down, where the city man's rationality ended and the primal fear began, he knew that the logic had failed. This forest, draped in its silent, heavy fog and populated by creatures that left tracks too wide for wolves, was indifferent to his spreadsheets. And the thing that had stood outside, breathing with the vibration of a sleeping mountain, had definitely known how to operate a simple brass latch it had not broken in. It had simply decided to see if the door was already open. The air of peaceful isolation had curdled, replaced by the bitter, rank smell of surveillance. They were no longer guests here. They were being observed, categorized, and catalogued. The curtain was about to rise on the true nature of the woods. The fourth day was the last day that felt remotely like a vacation. They spent the morning trying to patch the crack in the terrace door, jamming a splinter of cedar into the gap to stop the persistent rattle. By afternoon, a thick, greasy mist had settled over the trees, filtering the sunlight into a sickly yellow-green hue, and the air smelled like ozone before a heavy storm, mixed with the faint, persistent odor of damp, unwashed fur. They were having a late dinner. Canned chili Tiff had spiced heavily when the noise started. It was almost 9 o'clock, full dark, and the generator Tiff had brought hummed softly out in the shed, supplying power for the single weak overhead light in the kitchen. The noise came from the backyard near the stand of dense, interlocking white pines that grew right up to the edge of the natural ledge. It was not the sound of an animal running. It was the sound of something rising. It began with the crunch of dry pine needles compressing under immense weight, followed by the audible snap of a thick, seasoned branch that should not have broken so easily. This was the sound of a living creature committing its entire mass, well over 200 pounds, to an upward trajectory. Tiff froze, a spoon halfway to his mouth. Mallory's eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on the back door. "What was that?" she breathed. "Bear," Tiff whispered, trying to sound authoritative. Bears do not usually rise with such deliberate, almost structural effort. This sounded less like a foraging animal and more like a heavy piece of machinery being hydraulically raised. The movement stopped. There was a pause, a vacuum of sound, lasting maybe 5 seconds. Then, another sound. The slow, measured shuffle of something rotating in place. It now stood upright. Tiff pushed his chair back, the sound of the metal legs scraping the linoleum ridiculously loud in the sudden silence. He went into the living room, grabbing the heavy-duty aluminum flashlight he kept by the fireplace, the kind that doubled as a club. "Tiff, do not go out there," Mallory pleaded, her voice tight with terror. "I am just checking the porch," he lied. He did not stop until he reached the glass slider leading onto the small, shaky wooden deck that faced the pine stand. The air on the other side of the glass felt viscous, cold, and charged. He flicked the flashlight on. The beam was a solid 3-cell column of stark white light, cutting through the misty gloom. He took a deep breath, fighting the urge to vomit the chili, and cautiously slid the door open a crack. The cold air rushed in, bringing with it that heavy, musky scent. He aimed the beam toward the pines, holding the light steady. The beam stopped abruptly, swallowed by mass 15 yards away. It was a massive, shaggy silhouette, perfectly motionless, rooted between the closely grown pine trunks. The sheer size of it was the first thing that hit him, overriding all other terror. It stood taller than the door frame. Easily 7 feet high, its width was astonishing. A deep, barrel chest that suggested musculature far beyond that of any large mammal Tiff had ever encountered. The fur, wet from the evening dampness, was almost black. Absorbing the light, it was definitely on 2 legs, hunched slightly, its shoulders enormous and bowed. Its arms were disproportionately long, thick as fence posts, hanging down almost to its knees. Even though it was obscured by the shadows and the tight mesh of the pine branches, the density of its form was undeniable. It was a massive, shaggy silhouette, a statue of a primeval man, covered in dark, matted hair. Tiff could not move. The light beam trembled in his grip. The creature was absolutely still. It was not breathing heavily, was not twitching its ears, was not displaying any characteristic restlessness of a hunted or even hunting animal. It was simply standing, patiently observing. Then Tiff saw the eyes. 2 pinpricks of light, glowing a distinct, awful yellow gold, caught the flashlight beam and reflected it back with the flat, impersonal coldness of a night predator. These were not the blank, instinct-driven orbs of a cat or a deer. They were focused. A terrible, waiting intelligence resided in the reflection. It was not scared by the sudden light. It was studying the source. It was assessing. The creature finally moved, its posture shifting slightly, flexing those impossible shoulders. The movement was slow, deliberate, heavy, and unnervingly human in its economy of motion. It took 1 step forward, easing itself out of the deepest shadow, allowing the edge of the light to reveal more detail. Mallory, who had crept up behind Tiff and watched through the sliver of the open door, gasped, a tiny, strangled sound that Tiff barely heard. She was not looking at the height or the bulk. She was focused on the feet. The creature's feet were planted firmly on the wet earth. They were not paws. They were massive, elongated human feet, but grotesquely exaggerated. The heel was thick and flat, capable of bearing that immense weight, and the toes were long, powerful, ending in thick, curved, ivory-colored claws that dug effortlessly into the clay. It was the fusion of man and beast, rendered in horrifying, stark reality. Tiff's mind screamed for a rational explanation. A man in a suit, a hoax, a trick of the light. But the sheer mass, the awful smell, the stillness, refuted everything. The creature did not growl. It did not howl. It issued a sound that was less noise and more pure resonance. It was a low, powerful, continuous vibration, like a massive cello string being pulled taut and plucked once. It started low in the sub-bass register and rose barely perceptibly in frequency, filling the air not with noise but with pressure. The sound was designed not for the eardrum but for the sternum. Tiff felt it in his teeth, a profound thrum that demanded attention. It was a check-in, a declaration, a question without words. Tiff experienced the sudden, terrifying realization that this was not a confrontation. This was merely a field test. As the creature held that unbearable vibrating sound, Tiff heard the answer. From the dense black depths of the woods, far off to the left, came the synchronous, unmistakable snap of a dry branch. Then, to the right, the sound of heavy displacement, a slight sucking noise as a massive foot was pulled out of the damp clay. The creature in the light was not alone. Its call had been answered instantly. This was not a solitary beast wandering into their yard. This was a coordinated hunting group. They had been moving into position the entire time, while Tiff had been foolishly focusing his flashlight on the decoy. The chilling existential dread doubled. They were not facing an accidental encounter with wildlife. They were facing a tactical maneuver by entities that understood patience, perimeter, and coordinated action. The woods were now alive, silent, and entirely hostile. Tiff realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he was holding a flashlight, not a weapon, and he stood in the doorway of their flimsy wooden structure, inviting the night to come in. He slammed the glass door shut, the sound muffled and inadequate, and fumbled for the locks, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped the heavy flashlight. He had just seen the reality of the deep woods, and it stared back with focused yellow eyes. The moment Tiff sealed the glass door, they ceased being people on vacation and became soldiers in a pillbox. The first instinctive action was to call for help. Tiff grabbed his cell phone from the counter, his thumb blurring over the screen as he dialed 911. Mallory stood frozen by the window, watching the massive silhouette that still had not moved from its post by the pines. The phone connected instantly. Tiff heard the crisp, computerized voice of the dispatcher beginning to speak. 911? What is your emergency? We are at the rental house off the old logging road, about 13 miles past the fire tower. Tiff stammered, his voice unnaturally high. There are huge animals, things, standing outside. They are trying to get in. They look like they are standing up. They are surrounding the house. The dispatcher began asking for the exact address, the calm, procedural tone an immediate salve to Tiff's panic. He was halfway through spelling out the name of the nearest recognizable landmark when the line did not just drop. It died. It was not static. It was not fading signal. It was sudden, absolute, dense silence, as if someone had snipped the copper wire connecting him to the outside world with a pair of surgical shears. Tiff stared at the phone. The screen showed full battery, but the service bars were gone. Replaced by the universal symbol for disconnection, he tried again. Nothing. The entire spectrum of communication, the invisible web that connected them to sanity and civilization, had simply ceased to exist. They were utterly, technologically, alone. It is dead, he whispered to Mallory, holding up the inert device. The signal is completely dead. As if that silence had been the signal, the siege began. The first sound was a sharp, focused thwack against the north wall, followed instantly by the brittle, sickening sound of glass protesting against impact. A stone, perhaps the size of a baseball, had struck the window of the unused guest bedroom. It was not a wild throw. It was directed, precise, as if someone were checking the tensile strength of the structure thwack. Another stone hit the side of the chimney, high up, rattling the flue pipe. The creatures were not blindly attacking. They were testing the envelope. They treated the house like a structural engineer treats a bridge, looking for stress points. Then, the scuttling started on the roof. It was heavy, a dry, rasping friction, the sound of long, unclipped claws raking across the ancient cedar shingles. Tiff and Mallory looked up, listening to the horrifying noise echoing directly above the bedroom ceiling. The friction was followed by a deep, dragging pause, and then the unmistakable sound of immense weight shifting thump. 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 A heavy, measured pace crossed the roofline, slow, unhurried, utterly certain of its dominance. It was walking, sizing up the thickness of the structure that separated it from the soft, fleshy contents below. The pack, Tiff realized with mounting horror, was moving in concert. They walked the perimeter of the house as if it were a prison yard, applying pressure everywhere at once. The walls, the windows, the roof, the doors. They were evaluating their target, assessing the thickness of the door jambs, the strength of the old window glass. They were not panicking. They were analyzing. Tiff grabbed the heavy hunting carbine from the closet, a rifle he had not used in years, kept mostly for show. He checked the clip. 5 rounds of heavy caliber ammunition. Totally inadequate, he knew. It would not withstand the cold reality of a lead slug. "Get away from the windows, Mally. Go to the bathroom. Get low," he ordered, his voice cracking. Mallory did not move. Her eyes were fixed on the sliding door, which seemed to shimmer faintly, reflecting the dark shapes moving just beyond the glass. The pressure intensified. The stone stopped, replaced by direct physical contact. A sudden massive weight dropped onto the small wooden terrace outside the back kitchen door. The impact was not just a sound, it was a concussion. The wooden boards, old and brittle, groaned, emitting a high, whining note of protest, like the house itself was crying out in pain. The whole structure shuddered. This particular creature was heavy. It stayed there, settling its weight, leaning against the railing. Tiff heard its heavy, slow inhalations just beyond the thin barrier of the door. The air smelled immediately worse. Wet earth and a strong, rank animal musk that clawed at the back of Tiff's throat. It was not attacking, it was waiting. Tiff leaned against the kitchen island, the carbine cold and useless in his shaking hands. The lack of frantic violence was the most terrifying element of all. If they had been scratching, tearing, howling, it would have been animal madness. But this was tactical patience. They waited for the occupants to make a mistake, to panic, to grab the flashlight and run, to open the door and confront them. He knew their goal was simple. They wanted to force a response, to break the human resolve, to make them self-destruct. The creatures had time. All the time in the world. Tiff and Mallory had only the dwindling hours until morning, trapped in a house that now made pitiful structural groans under the relentless passive siege. The night outside was bitterly cold, maybe 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and damp. Tiff looked through the tiny high kitchen window, seeing the low white fog still enveloping the perimeter. The atmosphere, heavy with moisture and the pervasive smell of animal hide, felt like the inside of a massive, cold, pressurized trap. He slid slowly across the floor to the living room window, pulling back the edge of the cheap, dusty curtain by a 1/4 inch. He saw movement, a dark form, long-armed and wide-shouldered, pacing slowly along the far edge of the yard. Always just beyond the sphere of weak indoor light it turned, and in the movement its head shifted. Tiff could not make out the features, but he saw the shape of the skull, less rounded than a human, more sloping, powerful, almost simian, but wrong. The pacing continued, relentless and hypnotizing. "They are just walking," Mallory whispered, having followed him into the living room. She was clutching a heavy brass candlestick, a ludicrously small defense. "They are modeling our moves," Tiff replied, the words dry and gritty in his throat. "They know we hear them. They want us to know they are here, and that they are not leaving. They are wearing us down." This night, Tiff thought, staring into the impenetrable blackness punctuated only by the heavy, measured movement of their adversaries. Was the crucial lesson human speed, human intellect, and certainly human technology were utterly meaningless against the mass and patience of these creatures. They were beings of the primeval woods, governed by an ancient rhythm, and they had just begun to play their long game. They would wait until the sun rose, or until the house broke, whichever came first. Tiff squeezed the rifle, the metal icy against his palm. The silence, punctuated only by the heavy, purposeful steps, remained unbroken. They were being observed, contained, and slowly, systematically, broken down by simple dread. The coming of the sun did not bring relief. It only brought clarity. When the gray light of dawn finally filtered through the eastern window, Tiff and Mallory were huddled together in the center of the living room floor, covered in a sleeping bag, exhausted but not daring to sleep. The sounds of the perimeter walk had stopped precisely at 5:45 a.m., replaced by an intense, total silence. Tiff waited until 6:30 a.m. before daring to move. The air still held the strong, musky smell of damp fur and cold earth, but the immediacy of the threat had receded. He crept to the back door, cautiously sliding back the locks and easing the heavy wood open. The damage was minimal, but telling. The terrace railing had splintered where the heaviest creature had leaned against it, but the house structure itself was intact. What was chilling was the ground. The muddy yard was encircled by a perfect ring of enormous, deeply impressed tracks. They were not random wanderings. They were methodical, forming a clear, unbroken circuit around the entire dwelling, like the precise chalk outline of a gigantic trap. The footprints led into the forest at points and returned to the circuit. A relentless, non-stop patrol. As Tiff walked the perimeter, his anxiety ratcheted up with every step. Some of the tracks, particularly those closest to the house, had been stamped down harder than necessary. These were the tracks of the front paws, or what passed for them when the creature was briefly on all fours, deeply gouged prints meant to be seen. It was not mere movement. It was a deliberate statement of presence, a declaration of domain left for the inhabitants to find in the light of day they were here. They had surrounded them, and they had allowed them to live. On the rear lawn, right in the center of the clearing between the porch and the pines, they found a stark warning. A segment of a massive, rotten pine log, perhaps 4 feet long and 18 inches in diameter, had been stood upright like a grim, crude monument. Running down its length were 3 or 4 fresh, deep gashes, the wood splintered and damp with sap. These were claw marks, powerful and raw. Slicing through the dead wood like butter, it was an unmistakable territorial marker, a signpost hammered home by sheer physical force. It was not just a sign. It was a challenge, a claim staked in bloodless violence. They marked the yard, Mallory whispered, holding her arms tight around herself. They own this space now. Tiff nodded grimly. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if the creatures had left behind a heavy, intangible residue of their hatred. The air was thick with the scent of old, rusty metal, mixed now with the wet wool smell of their bodies. The absolute necessity of escape slammed into Tiff with the force of a physical blow. They had to leave immediately before the next siege began. They shoved essentials into backpacks. Water, the carbine, the silver-backed pistol Mallory's grandfather had given her, and whatever dried food they could grab. Tiff threw the packs into the dusty, 4-wheel drive pickup truck. They had one way out, the narrow, winding, 6-mile stretch of gravel logging road that led down to the main county highway. He drove carefully, trying not to stir up too much dust. Mallory sat beside him, the rifle cradled across her lap. The woods pressed in on either side, dark and foreboding. Even in the daylight they made it a mile, then 2. Tiff felt a sliver of hope widening in his chest. They were going to make it. They had survived. At the 3-mile mark, where the road curved sharply around a deep gorge, Tiff slammed on the brakes. The tires skidded on the loose gravel, churning up a brief, blinding cloud of gray dust. The road was completely blocked. A massive yellow birch tree, one of the monarchs of the forest, easily 5 feet in diameter, lay across the entire width of the track. It had not fallen naturally. The break was too clean, too sharp, and it lay at a precise, calculated angle, buttressing against a rocky embankment on one side and a thick stand of hemlock on the other. It was a perfect, unyielding barrier. Tiff shifted into 4 low, approaching the immense trunk slowly. He got out of the truck, the silence of the woods returning instantly, heavy and attentive. He walked up to the tree, tracing the line of the break. This had not been an accident. This was not the work of a sudden storm or a careless beaver. The tree had been felled or snapped and then deliberately moved. Deep gouges marked the bark, running perpendicular to the trunk, as if something with incredible leverage had dragged or shoved the behemoth into its perfect position. A normal man could not have budged this tree an inch, even with logging chains. It required inhuman strength and, more chillingly, tactical foresight. Tiff stared at the impassable barrier, his mind racing through the logic. The creatures had not waited for the siege to end to plan the next move. They had anticipated the morning escape attempt. While one group was thumping on the roof, another, likely the stronger individuals, had been miles away, setting this deliberate, impossible obstacle. It was the cold, analytical reasoning of a general, not the mindless rampage of a beast. It was in this moment, staring at the 5-foot diameter wall of birch, that Tiff's last vestiges of rational fear evaporated, replaced by something far colder and more profound. The realization of existential entrapment. They were not merely hunted. They were contained. They had not stumbled into the territory of animals. They had walked willingly into a carefully constructed cage built by thinking entities that played a long, patient game. He touched the rough bark of the birch. The odor of confinement was now overwhelming. The old, rusty, metallic tang of the damp forest floor, the heavy, wet scent of the nearby river, and the pungent, unmistakable musk of the things that had engineered their captivity. Tiff looked back up the gravel track toward the small house, now invisible around the curve. He no longer felt fear in his stomach. He felt the cold, hard certainty of being sealed in. They had not survived the night by chance. They had been allowed to survive because they had nowhere else to go. The game was closed. They drove the pickup truck back to the house slowly, the wheels crunching miserably on the gravel. The return trip felt heavier, a profound act of submission. The sight of the house, which only days ago had represented freedom and escape, now looked like a flimsy, temporary barrier separating them from absolute darkness. The rest of the day was spent in tense, exhausting silence. Tiff worked to reinforce the windows and doors, using every piece of scrap lumber he could find in the dusty shed, driving heavy nails into warped frames. Mallory tried to find an angle, any angle to communicate. holding the cell phone high up in the attic. But the electronic silence held fast. It was as if a local, invisible field had been established, insulating the area against all human communication. As the sun dipped behind the western peaks, the woods darkened quickly, and the air grew instantly frigid, dropping to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The atmosphere was taut, expectant. The creatures did not bother with the prelude this time. The second night began with immediate, focused aggression. Tiff and Mallory were in the kitchen, eating cold beans straight from the can, when the first impact struck. It was a concerted effort, not a random scouting probe. A series of low, guttural clicks and pops emanated from the tree line. These were not sounds of pain or anger. They were concise, short vocalizations, like military commands being issued in a language designed purely for the throat and chest. Then the attack. A rock, larger this time, the size of a grapefruit, slammed into the bedroom window with terrific force. The old, wavy glass spider-webbed instantly, the sound a horrifying crystalline shriek. The whole frame shuddered inward, saved only by the heavy, dry rot of the wood which somehow absorbed the majority of the impact. The window held, but the structural integrity was gone. A second impact followed immediately, focusing on the back door. This time, it was not a stone. It was direct, bodily force. Something dense hit the door jamb with a wet, cracking sound, and the old, dry fir wood of the panel actually split near the lower hinge. Tiff saw a dark crack widen rapidly, revealing a sliver of the black night beyond. "They are trying to breach the structure!" Tiff yelled, grabbing the carbine. He knew he could not wait for them to come through. He had to show resistance, even if it was futile. He moved quickly to the back door, knelt down, and aimed the rifle low toward the height where the creature's massive legs would be. He shouted a challenge, a raw, useless sound of human desperation, and fired. The heavy round erupted from the barrel with a deafening, violent roar. The concussion in the small kitchen was immediate and overwhelming, filling the air with the sharp metallic odor of burnt powder. Tiff saw a flash of movement outside, a ripple in the darkness just past the porch. The echoing sound of the rifle shot rolled across the gorge and was thrown back by the far hills, reverberating through the woods in a series of diminishing cracks. For a split second, Tiff felt relief. He had made noise. He had used fire and steel. He had asserted the apex status of the human species. The silhouette that Tiff thought he had hit merely recoiled half a step, a fractional movement, like a man taking a punch to the shoulder, and then stopped. There was no sound of pain, no panicked retreat, no howl of fear. The creature stood perfectly still for 3 heart-stopping seconds, and then, with awful, unhurried deliberation, it took the half-step forward again, returning to its previous position. It was completely, terrifyingly, nonplussed. The bullet, the most feared instrument of human violence, had barely registered as an inconvenience. Tiff stared, his hands shaking, recognizing the true depth of their predicament. These were not bears or wolves that feared the report of a firearm. They knew this sound. They understood pain, but pain did not equate to defeat. Their objective was singular, relentless, and unaffected by the violence of a lead slug. Their goal, Tiff understood, was not to immediately destroy them, but to relentlessly harass them, to maintain the pressure, forcing them to exhaust their defenses, or forcing them out of the house and into the open, where their speed and strength could be brought to bear, The creatures communicated again, a series of sharp, rapid kesh-kesh sounds, like thick, wet air being rapidly expelled. The coordinated attack shifted immediately. The noise above their heads intensified. No longer the measured pacing of the night before, this was frantic, urgent movement. They were attempting to gain purchase higher up. Mallory screamed, pointing toward the ceiling. The sounds of raking claws were now focused on the corner of the house. Right over the main bedroom, Tiff ran into the room, aiming the flashlight upward. The roofline was too steep to see clearly, but he knew what was happening. One of the creatures was attempting to scale the structure. A scraping sound, high-pitched and nauseating, started right outside the eaves. The sound of long, rigid claws finding purchase in the aged wood planks just beneath the overhang. It sounded like fingernails dragging relentlessly across a massive chalkboard. Then, Tiff heard the soft, sickening crunch of wood splitting, and a tremor ran through the whole second floor. The creature was pulling itself up the side of the house, using its immense strength and natural climbing ability, heading toward the small, rectangular attic vent window. It was not using its mass as a battering ram. It was using its biology as a grappling hook. The persistence was terrifying. It was not fueled by rage, but by awful, silent determination. Tiff raised the rifle, aiming at the general direction of the noise, knowing that if the creature got to the vent, the flimsy screen and single sheet of glass would be worthless. He was about to fire again, wasting another precious round when Mallory grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the wall. "Do not! Wait! There is something else!" she shouted over the frantic scratching. Her voice was pure intuition, a primal warning. They stood frozen in the dark room, listening to the horrifying vertical climb, the claws screeching on the planks with a sickening rhythm, the creature inexorably closing the distance to the single point of weakness above them. The air was heavy, charged, filled with the certainty of imminent, violent entry. The relentless scratching of the climbing creature was right over the wall plate of the bedroom, impossibly close. Tiff felt the skin crawl on his arms, knowing that the thing was mere feet above his head, calculating its final entry. His heart hammered a furious rhythm against his ribs. Mallory, reacting not with intellect but with instinct, moved toward the corner, stumbling over an old chest of drawers. She snatched the heavy, bright red lantern, the battery-powered camping light they had packed, and flipped the switch. The light flared to life, a searing, focused 500-lumen beam designed for distant trail marking. She did not hesitate. She angled the powerful beam sharply upward, directly at the patch of roof where the creature was scrabbling. Tiff watched. He expected the light to annoy it, to provoke a faster, more violent breach. But the opposite happened. The creature stopped instantly. The horrible, dry scratching sound ceased mid-rake. Tiff could almost feel the presence of the massive body hovering just above the eaves. The silence was instantaneous and complete, far more unsettling than the frantic noise moments before. He heard the creature's heavy breathing, a moist, ragged sound. Just through the thin wood and shingles, he kept the rifle aimed, but his finger hovered over the trigger, suspended by the impossible halt. Mallory held the light steady, shining it straight up. "It is looking at the light, Tiff," she whispered, her voice a strained wire. "It is not afraid, but it is looking." It was a protracted pause, maybe 10 seconds, but in that claustrophobic silence, It felt like an hour. The creature was suspended there, bathed in the fierce white glare, its movement arrested. This was hesitation, a moment of profound internal debate. And then, incredibly, the creature retreated. It did not fall. It moved backward with a smooth, controlled motion, claws scraping lightly as it pulled itself down and away from the roofline. It hit the ground outside the wall with a soft thump and immediately issued a short, sharp, resonant sound. It was an unmistakable vocalization, a quick, nasal henk that sounded like an all clear or a command to abort the action. The effect was instantaneous. The aggressive, low clicks of communication stopped. The sounds of heavy displacement around the house ceased. The entire siege, which had been building to a violent crescendo, was abruptly, completely cancelled. Within a minute, the night became absolutely silent again, save for the furious, frantic hammering of Tiff's and Mallory's hearts. The pervasive animal musk began to dissipate, replaced by the normal damp cold of the night air. The siege was over. Tiff waited 5 minutes, then 10, before slowly moving back to the kitchen window. He shone the flashlight out toward the pines. Nothing. The shadows were deep, but empty. "What happened?" Tiff breathed, lowering the heavy carbine, his muscles screaming from the tension. The light? They did not care about the bullet, but they stopped because of the light. "No," Mallory said, her voice shaking, but now laced with a sudden, chilling clarity. They do not fear the light. They feared going in. Tiff looked at her, confused. "But they were trying to break in, Mally. That is all they have been doing." "They were trying to force us out," she corrected, her mind racing far ahead of Tiff's slow, rational climb. "They were trying to make the house untenable so we would run into the woods. But they did not want to enter." She walked back to the bedroom, the beam of the lantern dancing wildly across the ceiling. The violence of the attack had caused small bits of plaster and lath to shake loose, revealing the ancient, rough-hewn beams beneath the dry wall. "Look!" She pointed the beam at the exposed wood. Tiff walked closer. It was old-growth timber, massive and dark with age. Running along the top of the wall, etched deeply into the wood, covered partly by peeling paint, was a mark. It was not writing. It was not magical or religious. It was purely, physically animal, yet terrifyingly deliberate. It was a grouping of 3 deep, curving gouges, sliced into the wood with immense strength, forming a rough, recognizable symbol, a tripartite claw mark, but much larger than anything the pack outside could have made. The wood around the marks was darkened, almost polished by time and use. "It is old," Tiff murmured, touching the rough edge of the carving. "It is a warning," Mallory said, her voice dropping low. "A marker, territory." The realization hit Tiff with the force of the abandoned rock. The creatures outside, the pack, were aggressive, tactically intelligent, but they were also bound by rules. They had been trying to drive out intruders who were squatting on a protected claim. Someone else owned this house, Tiff concluded. Someone who lived here before us. And that sign belongs to something bigger, Mallory finished. Something that predates their pack. Something they were ordered not to cross. The moment the climbing creature, blinded by the light, had been brought close enough to the raw wood beam, it had seen the mark. The light had merely allowed the creature to recognize its proximity to the boundary it was forbidden to violate. They were not saved by their own defenses or their wit. They were saved by an invisible, immovable boundary line. The house, in all its fragility, was not their shield. It was the territory of a dominant ancient predator, and the pack feared crossing the threshold of that claim more than they desired the humans trapped inside. Tiff looked around the small, damp house, seeing the sagging ceiling, the cracked glass, the splintered door. It was not a home. It was a fortress built on fear, protected by the ghost of a prior, far more lethal owner. And that owner, whose mark was visible and whose authority was absolute, was still out there, somewhere in the cold, dense silence of the foggy woods. They were trapped inside a cage that was protected by a larger, unseen cage master. The uneasy calm of the morning brought a new cold clarity to Tiff and Mallory. The external threat had retreated, but the realization of their true captor was far more chilling. If the house was protected, it meant they had a refuge, a fragile, temporary sanctuary built upon the terror of a pack toward their alpha. They had to turn the house into an active shield. Tiff, his pragmatic energy renewed by desperation, went to work. They locked themselves into the living room and kitchen, the most structurally sound parts of the first floor. They dragged the heavy, uncomfortable sofa and the massive, antique dining room table against the few intact windows. The shattered pane in the guest bedroom was hastily covered with an old, rattling sheet of corrugated metal Tiff found behind the woodshed. He hammered it in place with manic urgency, the cheap, thin metal sounding mournful and hollow as the hammer struck. They were creating an inner sanctum, relying on the structural ghost of the previous occupant to deter entry. But the creatures were not stupid. Their tactics were adaptable and cold. As the afternoon light faded, casting long, sickly shadows across the yard, the low clicks and guttural communications began again, much closer this time. They had learned the limits of the territorial marker. They knew the front door was protected, the roof line too risky. They knew the walls were difficult. The attack shifted focus completely. Instead of targeting the superstructure, the pack began an operation on the foundations. The initial sound was a dull, rhythmic thump against the joists beneath the floorboards. The house sat on a low stone and cinder block perimeter with a shallow crawl space. The creatures worked methodically, digging under the lip of the house, trying to gain access to the soft earth underneath the old structure. Soon, the thumping was accompanied by the heavy, scraping sound of wood being forcibly removed. The creatures leveraged their immense strength against the rotten supporting cross beams that ran horizontally just above the foundation, aiming to create a breach in the ground floor. The floor they stood on became the battlefield. The entire room began to subtly vibrate, a low, continuous tremor that intensified with every scrape and levering motion. The smell of wet, cold earth, disturbed from decades of dark silence, surged up through the floorboards, mixing nauseatingly with the heavy, damp animal breathing that was now audible right beneath their feet. Tiff and Mallory moved to the center of the room, listening to the dreadful excavation. It was no longer a siege. It was demolition. "They are going to come up through the floor," Mallory whispered, her voice raw with realization. "They know we cannot protect the subfloor." Tiff grabbed the heavy woodsman's axe he had brought inside. It was cumbersome, but heavy, a tool of desperate last resort. The vibrations intensified. Dust sifted up through the gaps in the planking. Then, with a sudden splintering crack. A small, square section of the floor near the chimney was compromised. It was a rarely used access panel, an old inspection hatch for the subfloor plumbing, hastily secured with 2 thin screws. The screws ripped out, and the hatch door flipped upward, revealing a patch of absolute, fetid blackness 6 feet below. Before Tiff could move, a massive, fur-covered limb shot out of the opening. It was thick, corded with muscle, ending in a 5-toed foot with those horrific, elongated claws. It was not just probing. It was trying to grab a solid hold on the rim of the opening, preparing to lever itself up. The creature's intention was clear: grasp the floor, stabilize, and climb out. The foot slammed onto the floorboards right beside Tiff's hiking boot. Tiff reacted on pure adrenaline. He did not swing the blade. He dropped the heavy, flat edge of the axe head, the blunt pole with all his remaining strength, onto the exposed knuckles of the creature's foot. Crunch. It was the sound of rock striking heavy, calcified armor. It was a dense, sickening, muffled impact that vibrated up Tiff's arms. The creature shrieked, a high, sharp, non-human squeal of pain that was instantly cut short. The foot retracted rapidly, disappearing back into the black hole. A low, ragged curse of air followed, a sound of frustrated, agonizing retreat. Tiff stumbled back, panting, staring at the black hole. The immediate tactical attack had been repelled, but the victory was minute. He had hurt it, but he had not defeated it. The sound of the pack outside shifted again. The low, purposeful thumping and digging was replaced by something chaotic and visceral. The brief taste of pain had shattered their calculated patience. They no longer operated with cold, tactical reserve. A vicious, chaotic animal rage had been introduced. The low, controlled clicks were replaced by agitated, frustrated snarls, and the sound of earth being torn away with insane rapidity. They were digging everywhere now, not just at the weak points, but indiscriminately, fueled by spite and the primitive urge for retribution. The house vibrated violently. Tiff and Mallory pressed themselves against the sturdy kitchen counter, knowing that this randomized, angry assault would find a new point of entry quickly. Boom. A heavy timber was ripped away from the southeast corner, followed by a rush of frigid, earth-smelling air. They were doomed. Their defenses were failing against this surge of pure, enraged physical power. Tiff raised the axe, watching the hatch, waiting for the creature to try again, knowing that next time it would bring allies, and they would tear the floor apart to reach them. It was in this moment, when the sound of the pack's frenzied violence was at its absolute peak, that the forest outside responded. It was a sound that cut through the rage, the scraping, the frantic, panicked breathing, and the hammering of Tiff's heart. It was a single, impossibly deep, resonating howl. It did not come from the pack. It came from the deep, dark hills, far up the mountain spine. It was a sound of absolute, overwhelming authority. It was low, prolonged, and so acoustically powerful that Tiff felt the eardrums of his inner ear flex painfully. This was not the frustrated noise of a siege breaker. This was a voice of pure, ancient dominion, demanding instant, total obedience. The sound contained the weight of millennia. The dominating, singular cry from the depths of the forest did not just interrupt the attack. It physically stopped it. The contrast was immediate and unnerving. 1 second, the house was shaking violently under the impact of chaotic, enraged digging and clawing. The next second, There was a vacuum of motion, a silence so profound it felt like the entire world had held its breath. The pack, frozen in the act of demolition, ceased all sound. The aggressive snarls died in their throats. The frantic scraping stopped mid-stroke. Even the heavy, agitated breathing seemed to be momentarily suspended. Tiff and Mallory listened, terrified, to the silence. They looked toward the small, dark aperture in the floor where the creature had withdrawn its injured limb, expecting a return to violence. But nothing moved. The only sound was the furious thumping of their own blood in their ears. Then the command was repeated. The second cry was closer, heavier, vibrating the glass in the remaining windows despite its distance. It was the same sound of pure, inescapable will. But this time, Tiff could discern a quality in the howl. It was not a warning to the humans, but a definitive, non-negotiable order directed at the subordinates. Withdraw. Now. The reaction of the pack was chillingly disciplined. There was no more chaotic digging. There was no panicked scramble for retreat. Instead, Tiff heard a distinct collective sound of weight being deliberately shifted off the foundation one by one. The creatures removed themselves from the walls and the earth, moving not quickly but precisely, following an invisible chain of command. The low internal kesh-cash clicks resumed, but this time they were clipped, quiet and submissive. They were checking in, reporting their compliance, moving into formation for an orderly retreat. The silence grew again, punctuated only by the receding, heavy tread of multiple creatures moving away from the house and into the dense pine stands. The forest had reclaimed them, swallowed them whole. The siege was over. Tiff waited until the first sliver of weak gray light began to appear on the horizon, painting the eastern sky a sickly, hopeful yellow. He stayed armed with the axe and the carbine, listening for any deviation in the silence. But the silence held. The creature whose will governed this valley had spoken, and the creatures outside had obeyed instantly, completely. By 7 a.m., when the temperature had crawled up to 47 degrees Fahrenheit, they slowly, cautiously ventured outside. The yard was a wreck. The porch railing was gone, splintered and tossed aside like kindling. The yard was churned up, the mud cratered and scraped. The earth around the foundation was severely disturbed. Massive piles of black soil and rock heaped up where the pack had tried to dig their way beneath the floorboards. They followed the tracks leading away from the house. They were everywhere. The wide, clumsy, heavy prints of the pack, all leading downhill and away into the deeper forest. But mingled with the multitude of pack prints were other tracks. These new prints were enormous. Tiff crouched down, running his trembling fingers along the edge of the impression. They were fully twice the size of the pack prints, the heel deep enough to have displaced a full pint of wet clay. The definition of the toes and claws was almost sculptural in the damp soil, denoting incredible power and mass. These were not the tracks of a large member of the pack. They were the tracks of a different class of predator entirely. These massive prints led not away from the house, but toward it, stopping perhaps 30 yards from the front porch, near the edge of the trees. After the pack had retreated, the prints led away in the opposite direction, toward the high peaks. This creature, the Alpha whose voice had commanded the forest, had approached the house during the height of the siege. It had watched the pack's aggression. It had observed the humans' desperate defense. and when the pack violated its self-imposed limit by attempting to destroy the Foundation, it had intervened, not to save the humans, but to assert its boundaries. Mallory stood beside Tiff, staring at the sheer scale of the prince. "It did not help us, Tiff," she said, her voice hollow. "It helped its own rules." "It was here the whole time," Tiff muttered, the realization sinking its cold claws into his gut. "It saw us Mally every terrified moment, every movement. It saw us fight off its pack, and it let it happen until they went too far. They were no longer victims of a random attack. They were players in a tightly controlled game. The house was not merely a sanctuary, it was a visible marker of the Alpha's territory. And by living inside it, Tiff and Mallory were now objects of that territory. They were a deliberate complication, something the Alpha had allowed to exist within its domain for reasons entirely unknown and utterly chilling. The terror now was not of physical violence, but of control. If the Alpha had allowed them to live, it meant their continued existence was contingent upon his rules. They were not survivors who had fought their way to freedom. They were possessions who had been placed back in their proper box by the landlord Tiff, looked up at the sun, which felt cold and weak. The woods felt enormous, heavy and quiet, a silence that was less about the absence of noise and more about the presence of a vast, unblinking surveillance. The fear had shifted from the adrenaline-fueled panic of the chased to the heavy, crushing dread of the observed. They were now the witnesses, the silent sentinels within the Alpha's domain. The day after the siege was dedicated to a fragile, desperate attempt at normalization. Tiff, the logic man, tried to pull his world back into order by using the only tools he trusted: denial and exhaustive study. "It has to be something else," Tiff argued, pacing the wreckage of the living room, trying to avoid stepping over the exposed subfloor access panel. "Some kind of rare genetic mutation. They are still animals, Mally. Just large, highly evolved primates. Or a very organized group of survivalists wearing suits the way they stopped. That is training, not magic." Mallory did not bother to argue. She stared at the dominant three-claw mark carved into the beam. Now fully exposed by the loose plaster, she knew that what had saved them was not human training or a large ape. It was conscious, territorial dominion established by a being with profound, recognized authority. The animal fear had been replaced by the intellectual certainty of subjugation. "We need to know the rules," she stated simply. "If someone lived here before and survived, they knew how to live with it." They began searching the house for clues about the previous tenant, whose territorial marker had saved them. The rental agency had only provided a vague account of a reclusive old forester who had lived and died on the property decades ago. Tiff went to the basement, a damp, chill space floored with rough-poured concrete and smelling perpetually of mildew and rot. It was filled with decades of forgotten debris, broken furniture, dusty cans of paint, and stacks of water-warped magazines. Against the far stone wall, almost perfectly concealed behind a huge pile of decaying burlap sacks and splintered 2x4s, Tiff found it a small, tightly sealed metal box, the kind used for tools or ammunition, bolted firmly to the masonry. He used the axe pole as a makeshift crowbar, forcing the heavy metal hinge open with a wrenching shriek of rusted steel. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilskin, were 2 items. The first was a handful of ammunition, not the standard brass-cased hunting rounds Tiff was familiar with. but 5 heavy-caliber rounds, meticulously hand-cast. They were dark, weighty bullets, not of lead, but of pure silver, tarnished a sickly greenish-black by decades of oxidation. They had been prepared with the loving, deadly care of someone who knew exactly what they were going to be shooting at. The second item was a small, leather-bound book, a diary. The script inside was tight, meticulous, and old-fashioned, written in faded fountain pen ink. The first few pages were standard meteorological observations: rain, temperature, animal sightings. The author identified himself as Hugh. The entries began roughly 30 years prior. Tiff sat down on the cold concrete floor, the smell of damp earth and rust heavy in the air, and began to read. Every word was a cold chisel chipping away at his remaining rational defenses. Hugh wrote about the isolation, the beauty, and the profound, silent presence of the woods. Then the entries changed. September 14th saw the fresh tracks again. No bear, no wolf. Too upright, too much weight. It watches, it waits. It lets you know it is there by the way the air stops moving. Hugh did not call the creatures a pack. He called them the shifters, always capitalized, acknowledging a change of form or nature. The breakthrough came 10 pages later, where Hugh described the entity that commanded them. He referred to it as the Governor, or sometimes the Alpha, a single dominant intelligence whose presence defined the territory. October 2nd. The shifters tried the north wall tonight. Same old games, testing the boundaries. But the Governor came close. I never saw him, only felt the weight of him in the air. He made them stand down. He does not want the house destroyed, he wants the house watched. Hugh went on to describe the Alpha as possessing an intelligence far beyond human reckoning, capable of complex strategy and, most chillingly, jurisprudence. The Alpha had a system. Violators of the forest were destroyed swiftly. But those who maintained the quiet respect of the territory, those who acted as silent, isolated components of the landscape, were allowed to continue. They were permitted to live as witnesses. Hugh's entry describing the carving they had found on the beam was chilling. I put the mark where he told me to, not for my protection, but for theirs. If they see the mark, they know this space is claimed by the greater power. I am the curator of his silence. As Tiff read, his scientific mind finally collapsed under the weight of the evidence. It was not a localized mutation or a cult. It was a hierarchy of ancient, terrifying beings governed by a single, impossibly strong thinking entity. The atmosphere in the damp basement seemed to thicken. Tiff looked at the green-tinged silver bullets lying on the musty cloth. These were not for hunting animals. They were for ending something mythical. When Tiff finally climbed out of the cellar, carrying the diary and the heavy bullets, he noticed the change in the house's internal scent. It was not just mildew and powder smoke anymore. A subtle, sharp, pervasive odor had permeated the structure. A metallic, slightly sickening aroma of ozone mixed with old, dried blood, faint but persistent, seeping slowly from the very core of the walls. The house was not merely old, it was soaked in history, and that history reeked of Predator Mallory. Read Hugh's journal under the pale light of the single kitchen lamp, her expression a mixture of dread and morbid fascination. The meticulous, almost resigned tone of the old forester conveyed a terror far deeper than the immediate adrenaline of the siege Hugh had not just survived. He had adapted, evolving into a quiet, fearful member of the Alpha's invisible ecosystem. Hugh's entry detailing the dominant marker, the very claw sign Mally had seen on the beam, was specific. It is the sign of the first. The shifters dare not cross it, not for fear of death, but for fear of being returned to the earth as dirt. The Alpha's wrath is absolute, and he does not waste effort on the unworthy. Hugh wrote that the Alpha did not kill those who respected the silence and his claim. He allowed them to exist, perhaps as a form of maintenance, or simply as living proof of his dominion. You could live here, the diary implied, but you had to be insignificant, a silent witness to the ancient order of the hills. The journal contained several fragmented, almost incomprehensible entries that spoke of the creature's history. He came to take his own back. I saw their eyes in the fog. They remember who they were before the change. This suggested a terrifying structure, that the pack, the shifters, were not born beasts, but something that had been transformed, retaining some ghost of human consciousness, memory, and sorrow. Tiff felt his core belief system, the belief in an ordered, rational world, crumble entirely. These were not random, chaotic monsters. They had structure, memory, and a history that predated the flimsy house they occupied. They were part of a deep, ancient continuity that the modern world had ignored, hidden here beneath the endless layers of fog and pine. He calls them his own, Mallory whispered, tracing a line in the journal. They are subordinate but protected. We are not. The mention of the mark prompted them to search the surrounding land again. Hugh had mentioned keeping watch over the Alpha's storehouse. They focused their search on the shed, a small, dilapidated structure built 50 yards from the house, reeking of gasoline and dry rot. Beneath a layer of loose dirt and gravel flooring, they discovered a patch of stonework. It was an old, primitive foundation, expertly laid, but clearly not part of the shed's original structure. Using the tools Tiff had retrieved, they managed to pry up one of the massive flagstones. The slab gave way with a horrific, sucking sound, exposing a black, rectangular cavity underneath. As the cold, compressed air rushed out, they were hit by a wave of odor that was overwhelmingly metallic and nauseating. It was a concentrated stench of decay, iron, and something fiercely acrid, like highly concentrated ammonia or ozone. The smell was ancient, deep, and fundamentally wrong. It was not a grave. It was a space, maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet long, partially excavated, lined with rough stones. And it was filled with debris, calcified bone fragments, bits of tattered leather and hardened scraps of hair, all fused together with layers of mineral deposits. It was a cache. This was the Alpha's territory marker, not just a boundary line, but a functional storehouse or lair where decades, perhaps centuries, of prey had been consumed or discarded. It was the physical record of the dominant predator's long tenure in the valley. They shone the flashlight into the depth of the cavity. On the opposite stone wall, etched deeply into the rock face, was another carving. This one was far more disturbing than the claw mark on the beam. It was a primitive pictogram scratched into the rock with tremendous force. The lines crude and profound, it showed a massive, upright figure, unmistakably the Alpha, towering over several smaller, subservient figures kneeling or bowing before it. The smaller figures were recognizable as human in form. The drawing was not an adornment. It was a testament to worship, fear, and utter domination. Tiff stared at the horrifying portrait of subjugation. This was not a biological imperative. It was a socio-religious structure. The creatures were not merely hunting. They were enforcing an ancient code of fealty. Mallory leaned closer to the stone, her breath catching in her throat. "The humans?" she murmured, pointing at the kneeling figures. "They are offering something. They are not victims. They are supplicants." They retreated quickly, replacing the stone slab, sealing the opening to the best of their ability, sealing the horror back into the earth. The metallic cold smell clung to their clothes and hair. Tiff looked at the impenetrable forest, thinking of Hugh, the forester who had lived and written here for 30 years. He had not fought the Alpha. He had learned the boundaries and accepted his terrible, quiet status as a caretaker and a witness. Hugh's journal was a guide to the rules of survival in this new, terrifying reality. The woods were now closing in, not with the noise of the pack, but with the massive, crushing pressure of history and ancient, malevolent control. Night fell. The 5th night in the house, a darkness heavier and more absolute than any before it. Tiff and Mallory sat in the living room, relying on the faint glow of the old stove they had repaired, having decided against using any lamps or electricity. Light, they realized, was interpreted as a claim, an aggressive statement in a land where silence was mandated. They were talking in low whispers, reviewing Hugh's final, truncated entries when the house began to shift. It was not the frantic, chaotic vibration of the pack's siege. This was a low, powerful, continuous resonance that felt fundamentally different. It was subsonic, a deep, rhythmic thudding that traveled through the bedrock and up the foundation into their bones. It was the sound of colossal, regulated movement. The Alpha was here. Tiff looked at Mallory, his face pale in the firelight. He did not need to check the windows. The sound told him everything. This was not an attack. It was a tour of inspection. The steps were slow, deliberate, heavy, and spaced perfectly. The creature walked the perimeter. But unlike the chaotic paths of the shifters, this path was precise, following an exact boundary. Tiff realized it was walking the line that Hugh had described. The invisible line of demarcation that separated the house and its immediate yard from the forbidden forest. The sound moved from the north wall, around the back, and paused right outside the patched-up bedroom window. Tiff felt the weight of it. The colossal muscle gathered just outside the thin barrier of wood and glass. They sat absolutely still, breathing as shallowly as possible, their bodies rigid with a terror that transcended fear of pain. This was the terror of being categorized and judged by an intelligence that regarded them as marginally useful, disposable microbes. Mallory slowly, agonizingly, raised her head and peered through the one remaining large gap in the patched window, where a shard of glass had been knocked out, but the heavy curtains remained partially drawn. She saw the eyes. They were enormous, glowing yellow orbs, not reflecting the weak indoor light, but generating their own cold internal radiance. They were only a few feet from the wall, huge and unblinking, fixed on the house. They were not filled with rage, hunger, or even curiosity. They were filled with cold, immense calculation. They were the eyes of a creature assessing the structural integrity of a fence. The creature's silhouette was darker, denser, and far more imposing than any of the shifters they had seen. It was wider, the shoulders immensely powerful, and the posture straighter, almost regal. Then the Alpha spoke. It was not a growl, a snarl, or even the resonant command it had used to stop the pack. It was a single, protracted sound, a deep, resonant moan that started in the deepest part of the creature's chest and expanded outward. It was a sound that vibrated not just the house, but Tiff's internal organs. It communicated a vast, ancient statement, a fact of the universe that required no response, no argument, and no acknowledgement. It was communication designed to bypass the ear and register directly onto the soul. Tiff closed his eyes, accepting the pure, crushing weight of the sound. He realized what the creature was doing. It had come to confirm that they understood their place. It had come to deliver the final lecture. You are here because I permit it. You live because you are within my territory. Do not challenge this. In that moment, Tiff's last strand of urban technological resistance snapped. He was a creature of spreadsheets and logic, and the overwhelming logic of this situation was simple. Resistance was not just futile, it was profoundly stupid. The human instinct to fight, to escape, to conquer was a laughable fragility against this immovable force. His internal monologue shifted completely. He no longer planned an escape route. He no longer worried about reloading the carbine. He thought only about how to remain still, how to become invisible, how to exist without offense. The man who relied on spreadsheets was defeated, replaced by the witness, the quiet occupant, the subjugated tenant. The immense rhythmic pacing resumed, moving slowly along the front porch, completing the circuit, marking the boundary again with sound and presence. Then, as suddenly as the arrival, the heavy vibration ceased. The yellow eyes vanished. The oppressive sense of absolute authority retreated back toward the cold heights of the mountain. The Alpha had gone, leaving behind only the heavy, invisible cloak of its presence. The air was now saturated with a feeling of massive, cold finality, a feeling that had settled over the house like a new, unbreakable lock. They were locked in the terror, but they were protected by the one who held the key. The next morning, the exhaustion was total, but Tiff and Mallory were alive. The house stood, battered and compromised, but standing. The quiet of the foggy woods was back, but it was not serene. It was the intense quiet of an environment waiting for a command. "We have to leave," Tiff said, his voice flat, devoid of hope or urgency. The siege was over, the inspection passed, but the terms of their survival were utterly unacceptable. They gathered their meager belongings, leaving behind everything that was not strictly essential, including the useless carbine. They needed only their feet and the open road. They drove the pickup truck down the gravel road, expecting to find the path clear, hoping that the Alpha's departure meant the pack's obstacle had been abandoned. They reached the point where the enormous yellow birch had blocked the path. Tiff stopped the truck. The birch was gone. A wave of profound, desperate relief washed over Tiff. He felt a hysterical surge of hope. But then Mallory pointed. Approximately 20 feet past the original blockage, the road was closed again. This time, it was not a fallen tree. It was a massive, old-growth pine, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, a tree that had been rooted for 200 years. It lay perfectly across the road, blocking the path with surgical precision. But this tree was different. It had not been snapped or chopped, it had been ripped from the earth. The massive root ball, a tangle of earth and stone fully 10 feet wide, stood upright next to the road, exposing the raw, cold underbelly of the forest. The tree had been pulled out of the ground with such obscene, casual strength that the earth around it looked like an explosion site. The sheer scale of the effort was terrifying. No pack of shifters could accomplish this. This was the unmistakable handiwork of the Alpha. Tiff got out, walking toward the impossible barrier. The break in the ground was fresh, the sap sticky and bright. The scent of ozone and raw, disturbed earth was potent. The message was clear, precise, and final. The creatures had blocked the road as an aggressive measure, easily overcome if they had the right equipment. The Alpha had blocked the road as an administrative declaration. The way out was not available. The Alpha had allowed them to survive the pack, but it had not granted them leave of its territory. They were not to escape. They were not to spread the word. They were now a component of the domain, bound to the silent surveillance of the hills. They were now the witnesses, the living perimeter markers. Tiff stood staring at the upended root structure. The truth settled on him like the weight of the mountain. They were trapped. Not by accident, but by design. They drove the pickup back to the house, the journey feeling like a funereal procession. They unpacked the few items they had taken. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful, but a charged, high-tension wire stretched taut around their lives. Every creak of the house, every rustle of dry leaves, was now a reminder of the massive, unblinking presence that defined their lives. Tiff went into the kitchen. He retrieved the silver bullets Hugh had prepared, the 5 heavy, green-tinged rounds. He did not load them. He walked over to the sturdy wooden kitchen table, worn smooth by generations of use. He placed the bullets in the center of the table, not as weapons, but as an offering. They were an explicit, non-verbal surrender. They were the rational man's final confession that his technology, his violence, and his history were meaningless. They were saying, "We see your rules. We acknowledge your domain. We are submitting." Mallory joined him, looking at the silver rounds gleaming weakly in the morning light. She placed her hand on Tiff's arm, a gesture of shared, profound resignation. She walked out onto the splintered front porch, looking toward the distant, misty peaks of the foggy woods. The fog was lifting, revealing the granite spine of the mountain range. And there, high on the sheer cliff face, silhouetted against the bright, cold sky, she saw it. A dark, massive shape, too tall to be a bear, too wide to be anything known, stood motionless. It was not looking at the house. It was looking over the entire valley, its domain stretching out beneath it. The movement was barely perceptible, a single monumental shift of its head as it slowly registered their presence on the porch. The movement conveyed ownership. Mallory realized they were now part of the history that Hugh had curated. They were the new caretakers of the silence, the silent witnesses to the pre-human order of the valley. The true horror was not the death they had escaped, but the interminable, quiet life of watchful obedience that lay ahead. They were free to live, provided they never ever forgot that they were now living under the shadow of the peak.